perhaps you might have just, imagined with a pandemic, with a cost of living crisis, that we're really much more focused on the economy now, and therefore Brexit doesn't matter anymore. And what I want to show you is that it still does, even though so many things have changed. And I want to show you why it's kind of still there in the background, but why our politics has moved on to a different kind of set of considerations, a set of considerations around competence, and why understanding that matters for the next election. But to do that, I need to explain this word realignment. So this is a word that political scientists use, and it's capturing the fact that up until 2016, you could still largely predict how people were voting for the two major parties on the basis of economics and on the basis of those things that correlate with economics, so whether you're well off, whether you're working class, and so on. But a gradual process had happened, slowly and surely, that a different dimension had become more important. That dimension is a cultural dimension or a nationalism dimension, or indeed a European Union preferences dimension, and those things correlated. And then after 2016, of course, the two major parties started competing on that second dimension. And where age and education had always been the thing that characterized people's views about that second dimension, those socio-cultural issues or nationalist issues or so on, the major parties campaigning on them meant that age and education became much, much more important to how people voted. And if you've been following UK and Changing Europe conferences and reports and everything else, you'll probably know that. But just to explain the word realignment, because I'm going to be talking about that for the next 10 minutes or so. So, here we go. So I want to say that the Brexit realignment is indeed persisting so far. So that change that was very significantly accelerated after 2016, we saw it in 2017 and 2019, that change in relationship of what predicts your vote, whether or not Leave voters are aligned more to the Conservatives, and also those Leave voters are likely to be older and have lower levels of education, Remain voters being more aligned to the Labour Party, those voters are less likely to be old, they're more likely to be younger and more likely to be professionals and graduates. And this is because the really crucial things that have happened since 2019 have been competence shocks. They've been all about performance. Now that's really important for understanding how the electorate shifts, because essentially what we're talking about is these are non-ideological things and they're shifting everybody similarly. And it's kind of orthogonal, if you like. It's on a different dimension. It's on a different axis to left-right competition or competition around Brexit or other ideological issues such as immigration. It's really all about competence. And both of those points matter for how we understand current politics, and both of those points matter for how we interpret, I think, the coming election. So one thing that's important to bear in mind is that since 2016, there's been so much switching, so much post-2016 switching of party choice on the basis of Brexit, and also people have indeed changed their opinions too, so we know that support for Leave has declined. But we also saw support for Leave increase after 2016 amongst Eurosceptic Conservatives who had voted for Remain. And the reason this is important is that we're going to look at the kind of persistence of these relationships. We have to use people's updated views about Brexit and their updated party preferences. And I'm going to show you a graph now that does that. And it shows the Conservative relationship and the Labour relationship. And this is the relationship between supporting Leave, supporting the Conservatives, supporting Remain, supporting the Conservatives, or the same for Labour. And the line in the middle is the 2019 general election. And I'd like you to focus on the dotted line. So the dotted line uses people's updated Brexit preferences and their updated party vote intentions, of course. And what it shows is that there's been so much stability in this relationship since 2019. Very small changes if you focus on the dotted line. You see a little bit of support going up in May 2023. This is using the last wave of the British election study data. But you really see that this relationship is changing in the 2017 general election. It's changing again in the 2019 election. And it's not really changing very much afterwards. And so this is, even though Brexit is not the primary concern on people's minds, it's absolutely the economy and public services. but it nevertheless is the pattern still of support. Now, what we also need to remember is that there are fewer Conservatives and there are fewer Leavers, and there are more people now intending to vote for Labour, and there are indeed more people who would vote Remain in a second referendum. So these are relationships of smaller numbers on the Conservative side now and bigger numbers on the Labour side. So why? Why is this? Despite everything that's happened, you might have thought all of that kind of focus on economics and the pandemic might have shifted this. Indeed, these are exactly the kinds of things that tend to cut through people's party allegiances, that tend to kind of wake people up and, we all pay attention to it. You can't avoid the things that have happened post-2019. And so, as I said at the beginning, the reason is, I think, that this has shifted, those things that have happened since 2019 have shifted everyone similarly and been on this non-ideological basis. So I just want to show you some graphs that are very simple illustrations of how it hasn't really mattered whether you're a Leaver or whether you're a Remainer once you take into account people's party choice, on how people have evaluated 4 key things. So the first is the pandemic, shock number 1. And of course this came hot on the heels of the 2019 general election. At least I think we had like 2 months, didn't we, of a gap, and then this happened. And so, we just exited the EU on the 31st of January 2020, and we were hearing this thing come out of all the news come out of China. So in May 2022, and it doesn't really matter if you do this earlier, we asked a question on how well or how badly was the government seen to have been performing on the pandemic. And I hope that what you can see here, we're looking at Labour voters on the right, Conservatives on the left, whether they voted Remain or Leave in the referendum. And I hope you can just see that there's almost perfect symmetry. There's just no relationship or hardly any relationship at all. It's very, very marginal how Leavers or Remainers are evaluating the government on COVID. So this is what I mean. Essentially, this is shifting everyone similarly. And we did a big in-depth piece of work around the COVID pandemic to try to understand this better, who was moving, those people that Rachel was talking earlier about, the weaker Conservative supporters who had supported Labour in the past. So what's the next shock? The next shock was Partygate, Boris Johnson. And so here we're just looking at evaluations of Boris Johnson and whether people defected from the Conservatives or whether they remained a loyal Conservative. And what you see here again, if you defected from the Conservatives between these periods, 2019 and 2022, that's dark blue. If you're still a Conservative, that's light blue. And essentially the relationship is very similar right across whether or not you thought Boris Johnson, you really disliked him on the left-hand side on a 0, or you really strongly liked him on the right-hand side on a 10. So the relationship is very similar. There's some marginal differences, but it's basically the same story. Budget, the mini-budget of Liz Truss comes next as a kind of competence signal. And this is a really important competence signal. This was a signal that has changed which party is trusted most on the economy, and it hasn't changed back. And those changes of which party is trusted on the economy tend to last for a really long time. So that's very, very bad news for the government. And this was indeed the moment that happened. So if we look at those evaluations of Liz Truss, what we see there, just between Remainers and Leavers, Conservative and Labour, very, very similar negative evaluations of Liz Truss. So not really making much of a difference how you voted Leave or Remain. And then the last one is, of course, the cost of living crisis. And here we have evaluations, and it's pretty much the same story. I mean, I'm just showing you the same thing 4 times, essentially, that your Leave or your Remain preference, how you voted in the referendum, once we account for party, is really not very making a difference to how people have evaluated these shocks. So these shocks are kind of shifting everybody equally. And that's important to understand for the election, because essentially what's happening is the tide is going out for the Conservatives and it's lowering all the boats at the same time. The Leave boats and the Remain boats, they're all going down similarly for the Tories. And they've lost more Leavers, but that was of course because they just had so many Leavers in 2019. So if 80% of your vote base voted Leave, and you lose support, then you're bound to lose more support amongst Leavers. But the relationship of whether you vote Leave and whether you vote for the Conservatives or would be likely to is very, very stable still. There are now fewer Leavers, there are now fewer Conservatives, I said that. And the key thing is that the rate of switching hasn't been significantly different. So there have been more Leavers switching from the Conservatives because they had more Leavers, but the actual rate at which people have moved has been very similar indeed. So why does this matter? So I think one reason it matters is that we're likely to see this relationship be an important indicator in 2024, assuming the election is held in 2024. And this is going to be kind of confusing because there's going to be big geographic changes, lots of those red wall seats potentially going back to the Labour Party. We might look at all of that and say, well, that's undone everything, but beneath the surface, beneath the bonnet, there will be a strong relationship, unless something very dramatic happens between now and then. And this may go some way to reduce volatility. The last panel I just slipped in towards the end, and one of the things that I would really wanted to kind of draw attention to is that volatility isn't always high. It's not always going to be increasing. And there are really interesting reasons for that. I'm really happy to talk about them. There's a piece in the report where Dan Snow and I actually show that volatility decreased in 2019, and it's not at the moment looking like it's going to be as high as it was in 2015. And the key other thing for the government at the moment is that their problems aren't really down to ideology, but down to competence and trust. So reputation matters more, I think, now more than anything. And I think it's why, or at least potentially why, some of these kind of resets aren't really resetting everything. It's really the politics of competence, even though Brexit still matters behind the scenes.